The first snow came to Mercy Ridge before the town had finished burying its dead leaves. By sundown, the whole valley was white, the road to Fort Laramie had vanished, and the old church bell was swinging in the wind without a hand to pull it. No one in town noticed the little girl standing alone beside the church steps. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? And if you enjoy survival stories, old Wild West stories, and forgotten shelter stories, don't forget to subscribe to Frontier Shelter. Her name was Clara Bell, small for her age, with a faded blue coat that had once belonged to a boy twice her size. The sleeves covered her hands and the hem dragged near her boots. Her mother had cut the coat shorter with kitchen scissors, but the cloth still swallowed her like a blanket. Clara lived with her mother, Ruth Bell, in a one-room cabin at the edge of Mercy Ridge. Her father had died 2 winters earlier when a wagon broke through the river ice. Since then, Ruth took in washing, mended shirts, and cleaned rooms at the boarding house whenever there was work. There was rarely enough money, but Clara never complained. She had learned early that poor children on the frontier grew quiet before they grew tall. That winter, Mercy Ridge was already in trouble before the first blizzard arrived. The town had been built too quickly and too proudly. The men had raised a saloon before they had dug a proper well. They had built a sheriff's office, a livery, a general store, and 20 rough cabins along the main road. But they had not prepared for a hard winter. The old people warned them. "This valley holds cold like a grave," old Mrs. Whitcomb said every November. Most people laughed. They had survived snow before. They had survived hunger, sickness, raids, drought, and dust. What was one more winter? But this winter was different. By the 3rd week of December, the river froze solid. By Christmas, the cattle were dying where they stood. By New Year's Day, the road out of town was buried under snow so deep that horses refused to move through it. Then came the storm that no one forgot. It began with a sky the color of tin. The wind arrived first, pushing through Mercy Ridge with a low, angry sound. It shook shutters, lifted roof shingles, and drove needles of ice through every gap in every wall. By afternoon, the snow was falling sideways. By evening, people were running through the street with blankets over their heads. Sheriff Amos Pike stood on the porch of his office and shouted for everyone to stay indoors. But indoors did not mean safe. Most homes in Mercy Ridge were made from thin pine boards. Some had gaps wide enough for a man to slide a knife through. Smoke blew back down chimneys. Water buckets froze beside the stove. Babies cried until they had no strength left. At the far end of town stood the old church. It was older than Mercy Ridge itself. No one knew who had built it. Some said Spanish missionaries. Some said lost settlers. Others said it was built by miners who vanished before the town existed. The church was made of heavy stone instead of wood. Its windows were narrow. Its roof was steep and black. The bell tower leaned slightly to the east, as if it had been listening to the wind for too many years. No one used the building anymore. A newer chapel had been built near the schoolhouse, brighter and warmer, with polished benches and a painted cross. The old church remained locked most of the year. Children dared each other to touch its door after dark. They said strange sounds came from beneath it. They said the floor breathed. Clara had heard those stories. She had never believed them. On the second night of the storm, her mother's cabin began to fail. The wind tore one shutter clean off. Snow blew through the window cracks and gathered in small white lines across the floor. Ruth stuffed rags into the gaps, but the cold kept coming. Their firewood was nearly gone. Ruth had saved 4 pieces under the bed, wrapped in old cloth to keep them dry. She put one on the fire after midnight, then another before dawn. By morning, only 2 remained. Clara watched her mother's hands shake as she stirred a pot of thin cornmeal. "Eat slow," Ruth whispered. Clara nodded, though her stomach hurt from hunger. Outside, the storm buried the cabin halfway to the window. Inside, the fire burned low and orange. Then Clara heard a crack above them. Her mother looked up. A second crack followed. The roof beam bent under the weight of snow. Ruth grabbed Clara by the shoulders. "Put on your coat." "Where are we going?" "To town." "But the storm now, Clara." They wrapped themselves in everything they owned. Ruth tied a scarf around Clara's face and pushed the last 2 pieces of firewood into a sack. Then they forced open the cabin door against a wall of snow. The wind struck them so hard, Clara nearly fell. They walked toward town by memory. There was no road anymore, no fence line, no wagon tracks. Just white air and white ground, with the shape of Mercy Ridge hidden somewhere ahead. Ruth held Clara's hand so tightly it hurt. They reached the general store after what felt like hours, though it was likely only 20 minutes. The windows were dark. The door was barred from inside. Ruth knocked. No answer. She knocked again. A man shouted from within, "No room." "It's Ruth Bell," she cried. "My girl is freezing." The door opened only an inch. Mr. Hanley, the store owner, peered through the crack. His face was pale and frightened. "I've got 12 people in here already," he said. "I can't take more. She's a child. I'm sorry." The door shut. Clara did not cry. She had learned not to waste tears in cold weather. Tears froze on your cheeks. They tried the boarding house next. The widow who owned it shook her head before Ruth could speak. "The stovepipe is failing," she said. "We may have to leave ourselves." At the sheriff's office, Sheriff Pike stood in the doorway with a lantern. "I told folks to stay where they were," he said. "Our roof is going," Ruth answered. The sheriff looked at Clara. For a moment, his hard face softened. Then a woman inside shouted that a baby needed more blankets. The sheriff lowered his eyes. "Try the new chapel," he said. They went to the new chapel. It was full. Families sat on the floor wrapped in quilts. Children coughed. A man argued with the preacher about firewood. Near the stove, two women held their hands over the heat like beggars. Preacher Bellamy saw Ruth and Clara at the door. "There's no space near the stove," he said, ashamed. "We can sit anywhere," Ruth told him. "The floor is already packed." Ruth looked around the room. Clara saw people turn their faces away. Not all of them were cruel. Some were simply afraid. Fear makes people small. It closes their hands. "Try the old church," someone muttered. A few people laughed nervously. "No one goes in there," another said. Ruth pulled Clara close and turned away. They crossed the street again. The old church stood through the snow like a dark ship in a frozen sea. Its stone walls were half buried. The bell above them moved in the wind, making a dull iron groan. The door was locked, but the side entrance had been broken long ago. Ruth pushed it open with her shoulder. Inside, the church smelled of dust, old wood, and stone. Snow had blown through a broken window and covered the back pews. The air was cold, but not as sharp as outside. That was the first strange thing Clara noticed. The second was the sound. A soft rushing sound came from somewhere below the floor. Not wind, not rats, water. Ruth did not hear it at first. She dragged two pew cushions together and made a place for Clara to sit. Then she broke one of the firewood pieces and tried to light a small fire in an old iron box near the wall. The flame struggled, caught, and began to burn. It gave almost no heat. Ruth sat beside Clara and wrapped both arms around her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Clara whispered, "Mama, what is it? Do you hear that?" Ruth listened. The rushing sound moved beneath them, low and steady. Ruth frowned. "It's probably the wind under the floor." But Clara slid off the cushion. "Clara, stay close." The girl walked slowly between the pews. The church was dim, lit only by the weak fire and gray light from the broken window. At the front near the old altar, the wooden floorboards looked different. Most were gray with age. But one long board near the altar was darker, as if touched by damp air. Clara knelt. The rushing sound was louder there. She brushed dust away with her sleeve and found a small iron ring set into the wood. Her breath stopped. "Mama!" Ruth came quickly. When she saw the ring, her face changed. "Don't touch it." But Clara already had. The ring was cold and stiff. She pulled once. Nothing happened. Ruth reached down and pulled harder. A section of the floor lifted. Beneath it was darkness and warm air. Not hot, not burning, but warm enough that both Ruth and Clara felt it on their faces. They stared into the opening. A narrow set of stone steps led down under the church. Ruth crossed herself, though she was not a church-going woman. "What is this place?" she whispered. Clara did not answer. The rushing water below sounded like a hidden river. Ruth took the lantern from beside the fire and lit it with shaking hands. Then she looked at her daughter. "Stay behind me." They descended. The steps were old, worn in the middle by feet from another time. The walls were stone, damp and dark. The warm air grew stronger with each step. At the bottom, the passage opened into a chamber beneath the church. Clara lifted the lantern higher. Her mouth fell open. It was not a cellar, it was a shelter. Stone arches held up the ceiling. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Some had rotted and collapsed, but others still stood. Old barrels sat in the corners. There were blankets wrapped in oilcloth, iron tools, jars sealed with wax, and stacks of split wood so dry they looked untouched by the years. At the far end of the chamber, steam rose from a narrow crack in the rock. Warm water flowed through a stone channel and disappeared into darkness. A spring. A warm spring under the church. Ruth stepped forward like a woman in a dream. "Dear Lord," she breathed. Clara walked to the shelves and touched an old blanket. It was stiff but dry. There was writing on the wall near the spring. The letters were faded, scratched into the stone with a knife. "For those caught by winter, leave more than you take." Ruth read it twice, then she sat down on a stone bench and covered her mouth. For the first time that day, Clara saw her mother cry. Not from fear, from relief. They stayed below for an hour. Ruth found enough wood to build a proper fire in a stone hearth. Smoke vanished through a hidden flue. Clara discovered a stack of tin cups, a cracked Bible, and a small wooden box full of buttons, needles, and thread. The warmth slowly returned to their hands. But Clara kept thinking about the town, about the children in the chapel, about the baby crying in the sheriff's office, about Mr. Hanley behind his locked store door. She did not hate them. She wanted to, but she could not. She looked at the words on the wall again. "Leave more than you take." "Mama," she said. Ruth knew what she was going to ask before Clara said it. "No, there's room." "No, Clara, they'll freeze." Ruth stood and faced her daughter. "Some of those people shut doors on us." Clara's voice was small but steady. "Then we know how cold it is outside a door." Ruth closed her eyes. The storm roared above them. At last, she took the lantern. "Stay close to me." They climbed back to the church. The moment Ruth opened the side door, the wind screamed in. Snow swept across the floor. Clara held the lantern under her coat while Ruth fought the door shut behind them. They moved through town like ghosts at the new chapel. No one believed them at first. "A warm spring?" Preacher Bellamy asked. "Under the old church," Ruth said. "There's space, wood, blankets, enough for many." A man laughed. "That place is rotten." Ruth stepped close to him. Her eyes were tired and fierce. "Then stay here and freeze." The room went quiet. Then Clara spoke. "I saw it." People looked at her. Clara was not known for lying. She was barely known at all. She was the quiet bell girl in the oversized coat, the one who carried laundry baskets with both arms. Her voice carried more weight than anyone expected. "There's a door under the altar," she said. "There are stairs, there's warm water, and words on the wall." "What words?" the preacher asked. Clara swallowed. "For those caught by winter, leave more than you take." Something changed in the chapel. Not all at once, not like a miracle. More like a frozen hinge beginning to move. The preacher grabbed his coat. Sheriff Pike was called from across the street. Mr. Hanley came too, carrying a rifle and looking ashamed before he even arrived. Ruth led the first group to the old church. The journey was short but dangerous. The wind knocked one man to his knees. A woman lost her shawl. Two boys had to carry an old man between them. The bell overhead groaned and swung as they entered the church. When Ruth lifted the hidden door, warm air rose into the room. No one laughed then. One by one, they descended. The chamber below filled with whispers, then with sobs, then with the small sounds of people realizing they might live. Children were placed near the hearth. The sick were laid on blankets. Men carried wood from the shelves. Women warmed water in tin cups. Preacher Bellamy stood under the stone arches and looked as if his whole understanding of Mercy Ridge had been split open. By midnight, more than 40 people were inside. By dawn, nearly the whole town had come. Some arrived half frozen, some came carrying nothing. Some brought food, blankets, lamps, tools, and shame. Mr. Hanley brought sacks of flour from the general store. He would not look Ruth in the eye when he set them down. Sheriff Pike brought 2 families from the edge of town himself. His beard was white with ice. His hands were bleeding from digging one door open. The warm spring kept flowing. The old shelter held. No one knew exactly who had built it. Over the next 2 days, people found clues: a rusted Spanish coin, a miner's pick, names carved into a beam, a child's wooden toy shaped like a bird. There were marks on the walls showing heights of children who had grown there during some forgotten winter, long before Mercy Ridge had a name. It had been built by people who understood the frontier better than the town did, people who knew that survival was not pride, it was preparation. On the third day, the storm grew worse. The snow covered windows completely. The new chapel roof caved in under the weight. 3 wooden cabins collapsed. The livery doors froze shut, trapping the horses inside until Sheriff Pike and 2 ranch hands dug them out through a side wall. If not for the shelter under the old church, Mercy Ridge would have become a graveyard. But even underground, trouble came. Food began to run low. The spring gave warmth and water, but not enough to feed a town. Mr. Hanley's flour helped, but there were many mouths. Children needed more. The sick needed broth. The old needed strength. On the 4th night, a group of men argued near the shelves. "We need to ration harder," one said. "We already are," said another. "Then some folks don't eat tomorrow." Ruth heard them. So did Clara. The girl sat beside the warm channel with a cup in her hands. She looked at the water flowing into the dark passage beyond the chamber. "Where does that go?" she asked. No one knew. The water disappeared through an opening too low for a grown man to enter easily. But Clara was small. Ruth saw her looking. "No," she said immediately. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to." But hunger has a way of asking questions no one wants to hear. By morning, Clara had made up her mind. She waited until her mother slept, then took a lantern, tied a rope around her waist, and crawled into the low passage beside the warm water. The stone scraped her elbows. Steam fogged the lantern glass. Behind her, the shelter sounds faded until she heard only water and her own breath. The passage bent sharply, then widened. Clara crawled forward and found herself in a second chamber. This one was smaller and colder, but dry. Wooden crates were stacked along one wall. Most had broken open with age. Some were empty, but not all. Clara opened the first crate and found sealed tins. Beans, salt pork, dried apples, hard biscuits wrapped in cloth. Her heart beat so loudly she thought the whole town might hear it. Then she saw another door. This one was made of thick wood with iron straps. It stood at the far end of the chamber, half hidden behind fallen stones. Clara pushed it, but it would not move. She pulled. Nothing. Then she noticed a bar across it. Not locked from the outside, locked from her side. She lifted the bar. The door opened inward with a deep groan. Cold air rushed in. Beyond it was a tunnel leading upward. Clara climbed. At the top she found a trapdoor covered with brush and snow. When she pushed it open, she saw gray sky and trees. She had come out beyond the North Ridge, outside the worst drifts that blocked the town road. For a moment, Clara stood in the snow and understood what the forgotten builders had made. The old church was not only a shelter, it was an escape route. She climbed back down, loaded what tins she could drag, and returned through the low passage. When she emerged into the main chamber, her mother was awake and frantic. Ruth grabbed her and held her so hard Clara could barely breathe. Then she saw the food. The whole shelter went still. Sheriff Pike knelt beside the tins. "Where did you find this?" Clara pointed to the water passage. "There's another room, and a tunnel out beyond the ridge." No one spoke for several seconds. Then Preacher Bellamy whispered, "That child just found us a road." The tunnel changed everything. Men cleared the second chamber. They brought back the crates. They widened part of the crawl space so adults could pass. They followed the escape tunnel to the North Ridge and found that the snow there was lower, the trees thicker, and the wind less violent. From that hidden exit, they reached an old hunting trail. From the trail, they reached a line shack 3 miles away. Inside were more supplies left by ranch hands before the storm. It was not enough for luxury, but it was enough for life. Over the next week, Mercy Ridge survived underground. The town changed in that shelter, not completely. People do not become saints just because they are frightened. Some still argued. Some still tried to take larger portions. Some still whispered about who deserved what. But the walls heard everything, and those words remained carved by the spring. Leave more than you take. Slowly, people began to obey them. A rancher gave his last coffee to an old woman with a cough. Mr. Hanley handed Ruth Bell a sack of flour without being asked. Sheriff Pike took the coldest watch near the church door every night. Preacher Bellamy stopped preaching long sermons and started carrying water. Children slept in rows under old blankets, their faces finally warm. Mothers rested. Fathers stared into the fire and understood how close they had come to losing everything. And Clara, the quiet girl no one had noticed, became the person everyone watched, not because she demanded it, because she had opened the door. On the 8th day, the storm passed. Silence came first. No wind, no bell, no screaming snow against stone. People climbed the stairs into the old church and saw sunlight through the broken windows. Outside, Mercy Ridge was almost unrecognizable. Snow-covered wagons, fences, porches, and half the street. Roofs had fallen. Chimneys leaned. The new chapel was ruined, but the old church still stood. Its stone walls were white with frost. Its bell tower still leaned east, and beneath it the warm spring kept flowing. When the road was finally cleared weeks later, word spread to other settlements. Travelers came to see the hidden shelter. Some called it a miracle. Some called it luck. Some said the old builders had known a winter like that would return one day. Mercy Ridge repaired what it could, but they did not rebuild the new chapel. Instead, they restored the old church. They fixed the windows. They strengthened the roof. They repaired the bell tower but left it slight lean, because by then people had grown fond of it. They built proper stairs down to the shelter and stocked it every autumn. Flour, beans, blankets, medicine, lantern oil, dry wood, and on the wall beside the hidden door, Sheriff Pike hung a wooden sign with the same words carved into it. For those caught by winter, leave more than you take. Below that, in smaller letters, he added, found again by Clara Bell, winter of 1888. Ruth Bell never again had to beg for work. The town gave her the job of keeping the shelter stocked and clean. She accepted, but she made one thing clear. This place doesn't belong to the town council, she said. It belongs to whoever is cold. No one argued. As for Clara, she grew taller. The old blue coat was finally replaced. But she remained quiet. She did not like speeches. She did not like being called brave. Years later, when people asked her how she had found the door, she always gave the same answer. I listened. Most people thought she meant she had listened for the sound of water beneath the floor. But Ruth knew better. Clara had listened to the cold, to the fear behind locked doors, to the old words written by forgotten hands, and to the part of her own heart that refused to leave others outside even after they had left her there first. That was why Mercy Ridge survived. Not because the town was strong, not because the men were ready, not because the buildings were well made. Mercy Ridge survived because a hungry little girl in an oversized coat found a door beneath an abandoned church and chose to open it for everyone.